The touch that killed. A single embrace between blood relatives that would condemn generations to unspeakable suffering. This is the story of the Hullbrook family of Ridgeback Hollow, Kentucky, a clan so isolated, so bound by blood, that their very genetics became their executioner. In the autumn of 1947, a young county health worker named Dorothy Clemens made her way up a winding dirt road deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. She had been sent to investigate reports of unusual illnesses affecting a remote community that most locals simply called the Hollow.
What?
She discovered there would haunt her for the rest of her days and eventually bring to light one of the most disturbing cases of familial isolation in American history. The Hullbrook family had settled in Ridgeback Hollow sometime around 1849, when Ezekiel Hullbrook, a coal miner from Virginia, fled westward with his wife and 7 children to escape mounting debts. The hollow they chose was accessible only by a single treacherous path that wound through dense forest and across a creek that became impassable during heavy rains. For Ezekiel, this isolation was a blessing. For his descendants, it would become a curse written into their very blood. By the time Dorothy Clemens arrived nearly a century later, the Hullbrook family had grown to approximately 47 members spanning 4 generations. But what struck her immediately was not their number, it was their appearance. Nearly every member of the family displayed some form of physical abnormality. Children with limbs bent at impossible angles. Adults whose faces bore features that seemed somehow unfinished. Elderly members whose bodies had twisted into shapes that made simple movement an act of agony. The patriarch of the family at that time was a man named Cornelius Hullbrook, known to his kin as Old Corny. He was 63 years old but looked decades older. His spine curved so severely that he could no longer stand upright. His eyes, a pale blue that seemed almost colorless, watched Dorothy with a mixture of suspicion and something she would later describe as profound shame. Old Corny's wife Mabel was also his first cousin. Their parents, who had been siblings, had arranged the union when both were barely 15 years old. This was not unusual for the Hullbrook clan. In fact, it was the only way they knew. For nearly 100 years, the family had married exclusively within itself. First cousins wed first cousins. Uncles took nieces as wives. In at least 3 documented cases, half-siblings had produced children together. The reasons for this were both geographic and cultural. The Hollow's isolation meant that contact with outsiders was rare. The nearest town, Bledsoe, was a 15-mile journey through rough terrain that few Hullbrooks ever attempted. But beyond mere geography, there was a fierce insularity bred into the family from its earliest days. Ezekiel Hullbrook had instilled in his children a deep distrust of outsiders, a belief that those beyond the Hollow meant only harm. This paranoia had calcified over generations into a rigid tradition. Dorothy Clemens spent 3 days in Ridgeback Hollow, documenting what she saw with the clinical detachment her profession demanded, even as her heart broke. She counted 17 children under the age of 12. Of these, 11 displayed visible physical deformities. 6 could not walk unaided. 4 could not speak. 2, she noted with barely concealed horror, appeared to be blind from birth and suffered from severe cognitive limitations. The conditions in which the family lived were medieval. They had no electricity, no running water, no contact with modern medicine. Births were attended by elderly women of the family using methods passed down through generations. Deaths were frequent and often unexplained. Children who were born too damaged to survive were buried in a small plot behind the main cabin, their graves marked only with rough stones. What disturbed Dorothy most was the family's acceptance of their situation. When she attempted to explain that their suffering was connected to their marriage practices, she was met with blank stares and hostile silence. Old Corny finally spoke. His voice raspy from decades of breathing coal dust that still hung in the hollow from an abandoned mine nearby. He told Dorothy that the family had always been this way, that God had marked them for reasons beyond human understanding, that outsiders could not comprehend the bonds of blood that held them together. He asked her to leave and never return, but Dorothy Clemens could not simply walk away. She filed a report with the county health department that would set in motion a chain of events no one could have predicted. Her detailed documentation of the Hullbrook family's condition reached the desk of a state medical officer named Dr. Franklin Webb. What he read in those pages both horrified and fascinated him. Dr. Webb was a student of genetics at a time when the science was still in its relative infancy. The work of Gregor Mendel had been rediscovered only decades earlier, and researchers were just beginning to understand how traits were passed from parent to child. What Dorothy Clemens had described sounded to Dr. Webb like a textbook case of what scientists were beginning to call inbreeding depression. the accumulation of harmful genetic mutations within a closed population. In March of 1948, Dr. Webb assembled a small team and made the journey to Ridgeback Hollow. What he found exceeded his worst expectations. The Hullbrook family was not merely suffering from isolated genetic disorders. They were experiencing a systematic collapse of their genetic health, a cascade of inherited conditions that had compounded with each generation of close intermarriage. Dr. Webb documented conditions that ranged from the visible to the hidden. Clubfoot was epidemic in the family, affecting nearly 1 in 3 children. Cleft palates appeared with alarming frequency. Several family members displayed a condition he had only read about in medical texts, a hereditary disorder that caused the bones to become brittle and break with minimal impact. Others suffered from recurring seizures that left them incapacitated for hours. But the most devastating condition was one that had no name at the time. Several children in the family displayed a profound inability to process physical contact. Their skin was hypersensitive to the point of agony. A gentle touch could trigger screaming fits that lasted for hours. A simple embrace could leave welts and bruises that took weeks to heal. These children lived in a state of perpetual isolation, even within their already isolated world, unable to receive comfort from their own parents without experiencing excruciating pain. Dr. Webb would later theorize that this condition was a recessive genetic trait that had been amplified through generations of consanguineous unions. When both parents carry a single copy of a harmful recessive gene, their children have a 1 in 4 chance of inheriting 2 copies and expressing the condition. In a population where everyone is closely related, the odds of both parents carrying the same recessive mutations increased dramatically. The Hullbrook family had become, in Dr. Webb's clinical terminology, a closed genetic system. They had been selecting for their own destruction for nearly a century. As word of Dr. Webb's findings spread through the medical community, Ridgeback Hollow became an object of intense interest. Researchers requested permission to study the family. Journalists caught wind of the story and attempted to reach the remote settlement. The Kentucky state government debated intervention, but the Hullbrook family wanted nothing to do with any of them. Old Corny posted armed guards at the entrance to the hollow and threatened violence against anyone who attempted entry. For 2 years, a tense standoff persisted between the isolated clan and the outside world that had suddenly taken notice of their existence. Then, in the winter of 1950, everything changed. Confira se inscrito nes canal. Se historias que revelamos, segredos, mais sombrios, escondidos nas montanas fazem su coração acelerar, voca precisa fazer parte deste tu monadade. Inscreva-se agora e nunca perca uma revalica. The winter of 1950 arrived in Ridgeback Hollow with a ferocity that the old-timers said they had never seen. Snow fell for 16 consecutive days, burying the hollow under drifts that reached the rooflines of the cabins. The single path that connected the Hullbrook settlement to the outside world became utterly impassable. For nearly 2 months, the family was sealed off from the rest of humanity. When the thaws finally came in late February, a mail carrier named Vernon Tucker was the first outsider to reach the hollow. What he found there would require 3 months of investigation and produce a coroner's report that ran to 47 pages. 17 members of the Hullbrook family had perished during the winter. The causes varied. Starvation had claimed 4, including 2 children under the age of 5. Exposure had taken 3 elderly members whose cabins had insufficient heating. Illness, likely influenza, had swept through the population and killed 6 more. The remaining 4 deaths were attributed to what the coroner euphemistically termed domestic incidents, though whispered accounts from surviving family members painted a far darker picture. Among the dead was Old Corny's youngest grandchild, a boy of 7 named Lemuel. Lemuel had been one of the children afflicted with the touch sensitivity condition that Dr. Webb had documented. His skin was so reactive that even the weight of a blanket caused him distress. During the harsh winter, when the family huddled together for warmth, Lemuel had been unable to join them. He had frozen to death alone in a corner of the cabin, mere feet from family members who could have saved him with a simple embrace, but whose touch would have caused him unbearable torment. The tragedy of Lemuel Hullbrook became in many ways the symbol of everything wrong with the situation in Ridgeback Hollow. Here was a child killed not by neglect but by the very genetics his family had created, a boy whose own blood was his enemy, a victim of decisions made generations before his birth by ancestors who could never have imagined the consequences. When news of the winter deaths reached Dr. Franklin Webb, he renewed his efforts to intervene. This time he found allies in the state government. The governor of Kentucky, Lawrence Weatherby, was briefed on the situation and agreed that something had to be done. In April of 1951, a delegation of state officials, accompanied by Dr. Webb and 2 county sheriffs, made the journey to Ridgeback Hollow. What followed was a confrontation that would be debated in Kentucky courtrooms for years. The Hullbrook family, now led by Old Corny's son Festus following his father's death from pneumonia during the winter, refused to allow the delegation entry. Festus, a powerfully built man whose left arm hung useless at his side due to a birth defect, stood at the entrance to the hollow with a shotgun and declared that any man who crossed onto Hullbrook land would be buried on Hullbrook land. The standoff lasted 3 days. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The state would not forcibly remove any family members or compel medical treatment. In exchange, the Hullbrooks would allow a physician to visit quarterly to provide basic medical care and document the health of the children. A social worker would accompany the physician to ensure that the children were receiving adequate food and shelter. This arrangement, though imperfect, opened a window into the Hullbrook world that had previously been sealed shut. Over the following months, the quarterly visits revealed the full scope of the family's genetic catastrophe. Dr. Webb, who personally conducted most of the medical visits, maintained meticulous records. He documented a condition he termed Hullbrook syndrome, a cluster of symptoms that appeared with disturbing regularity in the family's children. These included the skin hypersensitivity, but also profound developmental delays. Unusual facial features, including a prominent forehead and widely spaced eyes, and a characteristic curvature of the spine that worsened with age. What made Hullbrook syndrome particularly tragic was its variable expression. Some children displayed only mild symptoms and could live relatively normal lives within the limitations of the hollow. Others were so severely affected that they could not perform basic functions without assistance. There seemed to be no way to predict which children would be mildly affected and which would be devastated. Dr. Webb came to believe that the syndrome was caused by the inheritance of multiple recessive genes, each contributing to the overall condition. In a normal population, these genes would rarely come together in the same individual. But in the closed system of Ridgeback Hollow, where everyone shared a limited pool of ancestors, the mathematical odds had shifted disastrously. Among the children Dr. Webb examined was a girl named Rosalie Hullbrook, age 9. Rosalie was the daughter of Festus and his wife Constance, who was also Festus's first cousin once removed. Rosalie displayed classic signs of Hullbrook syndrome. Her spine was already beginning to curve. Her eyes, like those of many family members, were an unusually pale shade that gave her an ethereal, almost otherworldly appearance. And her skin, while not as severely affected as young Lemuel's had been, was reactive enough that she often wore long sleeves and gloves even in summer. But Rosalie was also intelligent, curious, and possessed of a gentle spirit that touched everyone who met her. When Dr. Webb conducted his examinations, she asked him questions about the outside world that revealed a longing to know what lay beyond the hollow's confines. She asked about cities and schools and books. She asked if there were other children like her, children whose bodies did not work the way they should. Dr. Webb found himself moved by Rosalie's questions in ways that challenged his clinical objectivity. He began bringing books on his quarterly visits, carefully selected texts that he thought might spark her imagination without contradicting her family's beliefs. He taught her to read more proficiently than the rudimentary literacy her family had provided. He became, in an unofficial capacity, her teacher. But teaching Rosalie also meant watching her deteriorate. By the time she turned 12, her spinal curvature had progressed to the point where she could no longer stand upright. By 14, she was largely confined to a wheelchair fashioned from an old kitchen chair with wheels attached. By 16, she could no longer leave her cabin. Through it all, Dr. Webb documented her condition with the same meticulous precision he applied to all his observations. But his notes from this period reveal a growing frustration that borders on despair. He wrote of a brilliant mind trapped in a failing body. He wrote of a girl who had done nothing wrong being punished for the choices of her ancestors. He wrote of his own impotence in the face of genetics that could not be undone. Rosalie Hullbrook died in the spring of 1959, 2 months after her 18th birthday. The cause was respiratory failure brought on by the extreme curvature of her spine, which had compressed her lungs to the point where they could no longer function. She was buried in the family plot behind the main cabin, her grave marked with a stone that Dr. Webb himself carved with her name and the dates of her tragically short life. By this time, the medical and scientific communities had become intensely interested in the Hullbrook case. The emerging field of human genetics saw in Ridgeback Hollow a living laboratory, a population that had inadvertently conducted a multi-generational experiment in the consequences of consanguinity. Researchers requested access, studies were proposed, ethical debates raged. The family remained resistant to outside scrutiny. But the quarterly medical visits had established a relationship of fragile trust, and gradually some family members began to ask questions of their own. They wanted to know why their children were born damaged. They wanted to know if there was any way to stop the suffering. Dr. Webb found himself in an impossible position. The honest answer to their questions was devastating. The only way to halt the accumulation of harmful genetic traits was to introduce new genetic material into the population. In plain terms, the Hullbrooks needed to marry outside the family. But this recommendation ran directly counter to a century of tradition, belief, and practice. It asked them to abandon everything their ancestors had built in favor of an uncertain future among strangers they had been taught to fear. The conversations Dr. Webb had with family members during this period were documented in his personal journals, which were donated to the University of Kentucky Medical Library after his death in 1983. They reveal a man wrestling with questions that had no good answers. How do you tell a community that their way of life is killing them? How do you balance respect for tradition against the imperative to prevent suffering? How do you help people who are not sure they want to be helped? For Festus Hullbrook and the elder members of the family, the answer was clear. They had survived in the Hollow for a century. They had maintained their independence and their way of life. The suffering of their children was a burden they accepted, a price they were willing to pay for the continuation of their bloodline. But among the younger generation, cracks were beginning to appear in this unified front. In the summer of 1961, a young woman named Martha Hullbrook made a decision that would divide the family for decades. She packed a small bag with her few possessions, waited until the dead of night, and walked out of Ridgeback Hollow forever. Martha was 22 years old. She was the granddaughter of Festus, and like most women of the family, she had been expected to marry a cousin and produce children to continue the Hullbrook line. A match had already been arranged for her to a second cousin named Harlan, who was 3 years her senior. The wedding was set for the following month. But Martha had been one of Dr. Webb's most attentive listeners during his quarterly visits. She had absorbed his explanations of genetics and inheritance even when they conflicted with everything she had been taught. She had watched her younger sister give birth to a child so malformed that it lived only hours. She had held her mother's hand as she died from a condition that should have been treatable had the family accepted outside medical intervention. And she had decided that she would not bring another cursed child into this world. Martha's escape was not discovered until the following morning. When her absence was noted, Festus organized a search party that scoured the hollow and the surrounding hills. But Martha had planned carefully. She had reached the town of Bledsoe before dawn and boarded a bus to Lexington, where she vanished into a city that seemed as foreign and vast as another planet. Her flight created a rupture in the Hullbrook family that never fully healed. Festus declared her dead to the clan, forbidding any member to speak her name. A proxy funeral was held, and a stone was placed in the family cemetery with her name and the date of her departure, as if she had actually perished rather than merely left. But Martha was very much alive. In Lexington, she found work as a domestic servant for a wealthy family who asked few questions about her past. She enrolled in night classes to complete the education the Hollow had denied her. She met a young mechanic named Robert Patterson, who was charmed by her quiet strength and her unusual eyes, those pale Hullbrook eyes that she had inherited from generations of intermarriage. They married in 1964. Martha did not tell Robert the full truth about her origins until after the wedding, when she was 3 months along with their first child. She showed him articles that had been written about the Hullbrook family, academic papers that discussed their genetic isolation. She explained what she had witnessed in the Hollow, the deformed children, the preventable deaths, the suffocating weight of tradition. Robert's reaction surprised her. He did not recoil or question his decision to marry her. Instead, he held her and told her that whatever challenges their children might face, they would face them together, with access to the medical care and outside resources that could make a difference. Their first child, the son they named William, was born in December of 1964. He was healthy. His eyes were dark like his father's, not pale like the Hullbrook clan. He walked on schedule, talked on schedule, showed no signs of the developmental delays or physical abnormalities that had plagued Martha's family for generations. Martha wept when she held him for the first time. She wept for joy that the curse had not followed her, and she wept with grief for all the children still in Ridgeback Hollow who would never have the chance. She had given her son the birth of a healthy child was not guaranteed. Of course, Dr. Webb had explained to Martha that she likely carried many of the same recessive genes as her family members. But by marrying someone from an entirely different genetic background, she had dramatically reduced the odds that any of those recessive traits would be expressed in her children. Robert carried his own set of recessive genes, as all humans do, but they were different genes than the ones concentrated in the Hullbrook bloodline. The mathematical protection of genetic diversity had begun its work. Martha would go on to have 2 more children, both healthy. She never returned to Ridgeback Hollow, though she occasionally received word of events there through indirect channels. She learned when her father died in 1967. She learned when a fire destroyed one of the cabins in 1971, killing 3 family members. She learned when Dr. Webb passed away in 1983, ending the quarterly medical visits that had been her only connection to modern medicine during her years in the Hollow. What she did not learn until much later was the effect her escape had on those she left behind. Martha's successful departure and the rumors of her healthy children that eventually filtered back to the Hollow planted a seed of doubt that grew slowly but inexorably. If Martha could leave and thrive, perhaps others could too. If her children were healthy, perhaps the family's suffering was not inevitable. In 1973, another young woman left the Hollow. Her name was Clara, and she was Martha's niece. Claire had been born with moderate symptoms of Hullbrook syndrome, including the characteristic spinal curvature and skin sensitivity, but she was determined to make a life outside the Hollow despite her physical limitations. Clara's departure was followed by others. Over the following decade, nearly a dozen young Hullbrooks left the family settlement, most of them women who refused to accept the arranged marriages that awaited them. Some succeeded in building new lives. Others, less prepared for the challenges of the outside world, struggled and failed. At least 2 returned to the Hollow, broken by experiences they could not navigate. Pause now and consider what you have just heard. A family torn apart not by external forces but by the weight of their own blood. If this story is touching something deep within you, I want to know. Leave a comment below with these words: "Their blood was their prison." Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Your engagement tells me that these forgotten histories matter to you. The exodus of young people had a devastating effect on the remaining Hullbrook population. With each departure, the genetic diversity of the Hollow's gene pool decreased further. Those who remained were, by definition, those most committed to the old ways, the most resistant to change, often the most severely affected by the conditions that had accumulated over generations. By 1980, the population of Ridgeback Hollow had declined to fewer than 20 permanent residents. Most were elderly or severely disabled. The youngest member was a boy of 8 named Ephraim, the son of Festus's grandson Luther and Luther's wife, who was also Luther's half-sister. Ephraim displayed every symptom of Hullbrook syndrome in its most severe form. He could not walk, could not speak, and experienced such extreme touch sensitivity that any physical contact caused him to scream until he lost consciousness. Ephraim became in many ways the final symbol of the Hullbrook tragedy. He was a child born into suffering not through any fault of his own but through the accumulated choices of 6 generations before him. His existence was a living indictment of the isolation his family had chosen and the price they had paid for it. In 1985, a graduate student in anthropology named Susan Whitfield received permission to conduct field research in Ridgeback Hollow. The family, now reduced to 17 members, had grown too weak to resist outside intrusion with the vigor of previous generations. The patriarch, Luther Hullbrook, was 61 years old and suffering from the advanced stages of the spinal degeneration that had claimed so many of his relatives. Susan spent 6 months living in and around the Hollow, documenting what remained of Hullbrook culture and recording oral histories from the eldest surviving members. Her dissertation, completed in 1988 and later expanded into a book, remains the most comprehensive account of the family's final years. What Susan found was a community in its death throes. The cabins, once maintained with careful attention, were falling into disrepair. The fields that had provided sustenance for generations lay fallow. The family cemetery behind the main cabin had grown so crowded that new graves had to be dug in a secondary plot further up the hillside. But beyond the physical deterioration, Susan documented something even more troubling: a profound psychological collapse. The remaining Hullbrooks exhibited what she termed hereditary fatalism, a belief so deeply ingrained that suffering was their natural lot that they had abandoned any effort to prevent or mitigate it. When Susan asked Luther why the family had never sought outside help, even when children were dying of preventable conditions, his answer chilled her. He said that the Hullbrooks were marked, that their blood was different from other people's blood, that doctors and hospitals were for normal folk, not for them. He spoke as if the family's genetic isolation were a spiritual rather than biological reality, as if their suffering were divinely ordained rather than humanly created. This fusion of genetic determinism and religious fatalism had become the family's coping mechanism. If suffering was God's will, then no human intervention could or should prevent it. If the Hullbrook blood was cursed, then nothing could be done but endure. This belief system absolved the living of responsibility while ensuring that nothing would change. Susan also documented the final years of young Ephraim, who was 13 when she began her research. His condition had not improved. If anything, it had worsened. The touch sensitivity that had plagued him from birth had become so extreme that he spent most of his days in a small room constructed specifically for him, with padded walls and floor to minimize accidental contact with hard surfaces. His mother, Lucille, was the only person who could approach him without triggering his screaming episodes, and even she had to move with agonizing slowness, telegraphing every gesture before making it. The bond between mother and son was heartbreaking to witness. Here was a woman who could not embrace her child, could not offer the simple comfort of a hug or a caress, could only sit near him and speak softly while he rocked back and forth in the dim light. Susan asked Lucille if she ever considered taking Ephraim to see specialists who might help manage his condition. Lucille's response revealed the depth of the family's resignation. She said that she had thought about it years ago, but Luther had forbidden it. The family handled its own problems, he said. They always had. And Lucille, conditioned by a lifetime of obedience, had accepted this decree even as it condemned her son to unnecessary suffering. Ephraim died in the winter of 1989 at the age of 17. The cause, according to the county medical examiner who was summoned to the Hollow for the first time in decades, was complications from pneumonia. But Susan, who had witnessed his final weeks, believed that he had simply given up. His body, already compromised by genetic inheritance, had no reserves left to fight the infection. His spirit, worn down by a lifetime of isolation and pain, had no reason to try. His death reduced the Hullbrook population to 16. Within 5 years, that number would fall to 9. The old were dying off and no new children were being born. The Hollow was emptying not through exodus but through extinction. In 1993, the state of Kentucky conducted a formal assessment of the remaining Hullbrook family members. The findings were presented to the county court in a closed session due to the sensitive nature of the information. Of the 9 surviving Hullbrooks, 7 displayed significant physical or cognitive disabilities attributed to generations of consanguinity. The 2 who did not were an elderly couple, Marcus and Betty Hullbrook, who had married in 1947 and produced no children. The court ordered that social services be made available to the remaining family members, though it stopped short of forced relocation. A social worker was assigned to visit the Hollow monthly and ensure that basic needs were being met. Medical transport was offered for any family member who wished to seek treatment at the county hospital. Only one person accepted this offer. Her name was Nell Hullbrook, and she was 67 years old. Nell had spent her entire life in the Hollow, marrying a cousin at 16 and burying 3 children before they reached adulthood. She had watched her husband die slowly of the bone disease that had stolen his ability to walk. She had endured pain and loss beyond what most humans could imagine. But when the social worker offered her a ride to the hospital to have her failing eyesight examined, something shifted in Nell. She said yes. And that single word marked the beginning of the end for Ridgeback Hollow as a functioning community. Nell's trip to the county hospital was her first journey outside the Hollow in over 50 years. The experience overwhelmed her. The lights, the sounds, the sheer number of people moving in all directions left her disoriented and frightened, but the doctors were kind. They diagnosed her with cataracts that could be surgically corrected. They offered her the gift of sight. Nell underwent the surgery and returned to the Hollow with a new understanding of what she had been denied. She had seen the world outside, and it was not the threatening wilderness her family had described. It was a place of kindness and possibility, a place where suffering could be treated rather than simply endured. She began to advocate for the remaining family members to seek outside help. Her efforts were met with resistance from Luther, who remained committed to the old ways until his death in 1995. But with Luther gone, the family's resistance crumbled. One by one, the survivors accepted the medical and social services that were offered. Some moved to assisted living facilities in nearby towns. Others remained in the Hollow but welcomed regular visits from healthcare providers. By 1998, only 3 Hullbrooks remained in Ridgeback Hollow, Nell, her cousin Gordon, and Gordon's wife Edna. They were the last permanent residents of a settlement that had existed for nearly 150 years. The final chapter of the Hullbrook story is not one of dramatic revelation, but of quiet dissolution. Nell Hullbrook passed away in 2001 peacefully in her sleep, in the cabin where she had been born 81 years earlier. Gordon and Edna followed within months of each other in 2003, leaving Ridgeback Hollow without a single living inhabitant for the first time since 1849. The property, which had never been formally surveyed or titled, reverted to the state of Kentucky through a complex legal process that took several years to complete. In 2007, the hollow was incorporated into the Daniel Boone National Forest. The remaining structures, deemed too fragile to preserve, were allowed to decay naturally. Today, only stone foundations and the overgrown family cemetery mark the spot where the Hullbrooks lived and died and suffered. But the legacy of Ridgeback Hollow extends far beyond its physical boundaries. The case became a foundational study in the emerging field of genetic counseling. Dr. Franklin Webb's meticulous records, preserved at the University of Kentucky, have been cited in hundreds of academic papers. The Hullbrook family's experience is taught in medical schools as a cautionary example of the consequences of genetic isolation. For those who escaped the hollow, the legacy is more personal. Martha Patterson, who died in 2011 at the age of 72, spent her final decades working with genetic counseling organizations to help families understand the risks of consanguineous relationships. She never publicly revealed her connection to the Hullbrook case, but those who knew her understood the passion that drove her advocacy. Her children and grandchildren, none of whom display any symptoms of Hullbrook syndrome, represent the other possible ending to this story. They are proof that the curse was not truly a curse but a consequence of choices that could be made differently. They carry the Hullbrook genes, those recessive mutations that wreaked such havoc in the hollow, but diluted now, scattered across a broader genetic landscape where they cause no harm. The scientific understanding that emerged from the Hullbrook case has saved countless lives. Today, genetic counseling is available to couples who may be at risk of producing children with hereditary conditions, because can identify carriers of recessive genes. Family planning options exist that were unimaginable in Ezekiel Hullbrook's time. But for the Hullbrooks themselves, this knowledge came too late. They were victims of their own isolation, trapped by geography and tradition in a prison of their own blood. The touch that killed was not a curse from God or a punishment for sin. It was simply biology, the cold mathematics of genetics playing out across generations with no one to explain what was happening or how it could be stopped. The hollow is silent now. The cabins have collapsed into mounds of rotting timber. The cemetery stones are weathered beyond reading. The creek still runs past the settlement, and the trees still stand sentinel over the ruins. But no one lives there. No children play in the clearings. No families gather around evening fires. Some who visit the site report an oppressive atmosphere, a weight in the air that seems to press down on the living. They describe feelings of profound sadness, of tragedy too deep for words. Whether these sensations are genuine remnants of the suffering that occurred there, or merely the product of knowing the hollow's history, no one can say. What remains certain is the lesson the Hullbrooks left behind. Their story is a testament to the power of genetics and the importance of understanding the science that governs our bodies. It is a warning about the dangers of isolation and the price of refusing outside help when it is needed. And it is ultimately a tragedy of human beings who loved their families so much that they destroyed them, the touch that killed. In the end, it was not malice or cruelty that condemned the Hullbrooks. It was love turned inward, family bonds pulled so tight that they strangled the very people they were meant to protect. It was the embrace of blood that should have given comfort but instead brought only pain. Let their memory serve as a reminder. We are all connected, not just to our families but to the broader human community. When we cut ourselves off from that community, when we refuse the knowledge and the help that others can provide, we risk creating our own hollow, our own prison of blood from which there is no escape. This is the story of the Hullbrooks of Ridgeback Hollow. May they rest in peace, and may we learn from their suffering. Se voca assistu, 8 acia porca studisa historia. Dox commentare dizendo, EU assistiate, acim. Paracu EU passate conheser, saber quem romente gostadas historias acidu canal. Se andanao, conscrito inscrivase agora, ativ, o sino de notifixes. Est canal, a dedicato, a reveler, as historias meis, sombrias y esquecidas, a historia americana. Os segredos que as familias escondram por gerax as verdades que ninguém queer enfrentar. Dex su like nest video para que mais pessoas possam descobrir esta historia. E compartilhar com alguém que precisa conhecer a trágica saga dos Hullbrook. Coda compartilhamento ajuda a manter viva a memória daqueles que foram esquecidos. Obrigado por assistir. Nos vemos na próxima historia.